Chapter 13, The 100 Days. Monsieur Noirtier was a good prophet, and events moved quickly, as he said. Everyone knows about the return from Elba, that strange and miraculous return, with no earlier precedent and probably destined to remain unique for all time. King Louis made only feeble efforts to ward off this terrible blow. His lack of confidence in men deprived him of any confidence in events. Kingship, or rather the monarchy, which he had barely rebuilt, was already trembling on uncertain foundations, and a single gesture from the emperor brought the entire edifice crashing down, a shapeless compound of old prejudices and new ideas. So Villefort received nothing from this king except gratitude, and that was not only useless for the time being, but actually dangerous, as the cross of the Legion of Honor, which he was wise enough not to display, even though Monsieur de Blacas had done as the king required and duly sent him the certificate. Villefort would surely have been dismissed by Napoleon, had it not been for the protection of Noirtier, who had become all-powerful at court under the 100 Days, both for the danger that he had run and for the services he had rendered. So, as promised, the Girondin of '93 and the Senator of 1806 protected the man who had earlier protected him. Consequently, all of Villefort's efforts during this reincarnation of the Empire, which it was not difficult to predict would fall again, consisted in suppressing the secret which Dantes had been on point of divulging. The Crown Prosecutor alone was dismissed, suspected of lack of enthusiasm for Bonapartism. The imperial regime was re-established, which meant that the emperor moved into the Tuileries that Louis had just left and began to issue a host of different orders from the little study into which, hard on the heels of Villefort, we recently introduced our readers, and from the walnut table on which he found Louis' snuff-box, wide open and still half full. And no sooner had this happened than Marseille, despite the attitude of its judiciary, began to feel the warmth of those smoldering fires of civil war that are never entirely extinguished in the South. The reprisals threatened to exceed the occasional rowdy outburst against the houses of royalists who decided to stay indoors, or public insults hurled at those who ventured outside. Naturally, the turn of events meant that the worthy shipowner, whom we have already described as a supporter of the People's Party, found himself in these circumstances, if not exactly all-powerful, since Monsieur Morel was a cautious and slightly timid man, like all those who have made their fortunes in trade by their own laborious efforts, at least able to stand up and lodge a complaint, even though he was dismissed as a moderate by Bonapartist fanatics. And his complaint, as one may easily imagine, concerned Dantes. Villefort had remained on his feet, despite his superior's dismissal, but his wedding, though still agreed in principle, had been postponed until more propitious times. If the emperor should keep his throne, then Gerard would need to marry into another family, and his father would find it a suitable match for him. If Louis XVIII returned to France under a second restoration, Monsieur de Saint-Méran's influence and his own would be greatly increased, and the union would become more favorable to him than ever. So, for the time being, the deputy crown prosecutor was the principal magistrate in Marseille, and, one day, his door opened and Monsieur Morel was announced. Anyone else would have hastened to greet the shipowner, betraying his own weakness in haste. But Villefort was a man of superior intelligence, who, though he had little experience of the world, had an instinct for it. He kept Monsieur Morel waiting, as he would have done under the Restoration, not because he had anyone with him, but simply because it is normal for a crown prosecutor to keep people waiting. Then after a quarter of an hour, which he spent reading 2 or 3 newspapers of various persuasions, he gave the order for the shipowner to be shown in. Monsieur Morel expected to find Villefort dejected, but he found him as he had seen him 6 weeks earlier, that is to say, calm, firm, and full of the distant good manners that make up for the most impenetrable of barriers separating a well-bred man from one of the people. He had entered Villefort's chambers, convinced that the magistrate would tremble at the sight of him, only to discover that, on the contrary, He was himself overcome with nervousness and anxiety when confronted with this man who was waiting for him with an inquiring look and his elbows resting on the desk. He paused at the door. Villefort examined him, and though he could not quite remember who he was, at last, after studying him in silence for some seconds, during which the good shipowner twisted and untwisted his hat in his hands, Villefort said, "Monsieur Morel, I believe?" "Yes, monsieur, I am he," the shipowner replied. The magistrate gestured protectively with his hand. "Come over here and tell me to what I owe the honor of this visit." "Have you no idea, monsieur?" Monsieur Morel asked. "Not the slightest. But that does not in any way prevent me from wishing to serve you, if it is in my power to do so." "Well, it depends entirely on you, monsieur," said Morel. "So please explain." "Monsieur," continued the shipowner, gaining in confidence as he spoke, and further strengthened by the justice of his case and the clarity of his position, "you remember that, a few days before the news of His Majesty the Emperor's landing, I came to beg your indulgence for an unfortunate young man, a sailor who was a second mate on board my brig. You will recall that he was accused of being in contact with the island of Elba. This connection, though a crime in those days, is now a recommendation. At that time, you served Louis XVIII, and you did so unreservedly, monsieur. That was your duty. Today you are serving Napoleon, and you should protect him. That, too, is your duty. So I have come to ask you what became of him." Villefort struggled to contain his feelings. "What's the man's name?" he asked. "Please be so good as to tell me his name." "Edmond Dantes." Of course, Villefort would have been as happy to confront an armed adversary in a duel at 25 paces as to have this name fired at him point blank, yet he did not raise an eyebrow. In this way, he thought, no one can accuse me of having any personal interest in arresting this young man. "Dantes?" he asked aloud. "Edmond Dantes, you said?" "Yes, monsieur." Villefort opened a large register housed in a pigeonhole near his desk, then crossed to a table and, from that table, went over to some files before turning back to the shipowner. "Are you sure that you're not mistaken, monsieur?" he asked in the most natural tone of voice. If Morel had been more sharp-witted, or better informed about the matter, he would have found it odd that the deputy crown prosecutor even deigned to answer him on a subject which was entirely outside his competence, and he might have wondered why Villefort did not send him to consult the prison registers, prison governors, or the prefect of the département. But Morel, who had looked in vain for any sign of fear in Villefort, as soon as the man appeared to have none, perceived only a desire to oblige. He was no match for Villefort. "No, monsieur," Morel said, "I am not mistaken. In any case, I have known the poor lad for 10 years, and he has served under me for 4. Don't you remember? I came to see you 6 weeks ago, to ask for clemency on behalf of this unfortunate young man, just as today I am speaking for justice. In fact, your manner was quite offhand, and you spoke to me as though displeased by my inquiry. Oh, Bonapartists could expect harsh treatment from royalists in those days." Villefort parried this thrust with his usual agility and cool-headedness. "Monsieur, I was a royalist as long as I considered the Bourbons not only the rightful heirs to the throne, but also the choice of the nation. However, the miraculous turn of events that we have just witnessed proved to me that I was wrong. Napoleon's genius has triumphed. The legitimate monarch is one who has the love of the people." "Pleased to hear it at last," Monsieur Morel exclaimed with bluff sincerity. "When you speak in that way, it augurs well for Edmond." "Wait," Villefort continues, leafing through another register. "He was a sailor, isn't that right, who was marrying a Catalan girl? Yes, I remember now. It was a very serious matter." "How serious?" "Well, you know when he left here, he was taken to the prison at the Palais de Justice." "So?" "Well, I made my report to Paris and sent the papers that were found on him. That was my duty. What else could I do? A week after his arrest, the prisoner was transferred." "Transferred!" Monsieur Morel exclaimed. "What can have been done to this poor boy?" Don't worry, he would have been taken to Fenestrelle in Picnerol on the Ile Saint-Marguerite, which is officially described as transportation. One day you will see him return to take command of his ship. He can come whenever he likes. The post will be kept for him. But why is he not back already? I should have thought that the first priority of Bonapartist justice would have been to release those who were imprisoned under the royalist regime. Don't be too eager to make accusations, my dear Monsieur Morel, Villefort replied. Due process of the law must be observed in everything. The order for his incarceration came from the highest authority, and an order for his release must do likewise. Napoleon has only been back for a fortnight, so the annulments can only have just been sent out. But there is no way of expediting these formalities now that we are back in power. I have some friends and some influence. I could have the judgment reversed. Well, there is no judgment in this case. Well, the detention order then. In political cases, there are no register of detainees. It is sometimes in the interest of governments to make a person disappear without trace. Detention orders would help to find him. Perhaps that's how things were under the Bourbons, but now, that's how things are at all times, my dear Monsieur Morel. One regime follows another and resembles its predecessor. The penitentiary system established under Louis XIV still applies, apart from the Bastille. The emperor was always stricter than the Sun King himself when it came to the management of his prisons, and the number of prisoners whose names do not figure on any register is incalculable. Even certainty would have been misled by such a benevolent concern, and Monsieur Morel did not feel suspicion. So finally, Monsieur de Villefort, what advice would you give to hasten poor Dantes' return? Just this, Monsieur. Make a petition to the Minister of Justice. Yes, but we know what happens to petitions. The minister gets 200 a day and doesn't read 4 of them. Certainly, Villefort agreed, but he will read a petition that is sent by me, certified by me, and personally addressed by me. Would you undertake to send such a petition? With the greatest pleasure. Dantes might have been guilty then, but he is innocent now, and it is my duty to have him released, just as it was once my duty to have him imprisoned. In this way, Villefort could avoid running the risk, small though it may be, of an inquiry that would certainly prove his undoing. How does one go about writing to the minister? Sit here, Monsieur Morel, Villefort said, giving the shipowner his chair. I shall dictate the letter. Oh, would you be so kind? Of course. Let's lose no more time. We have wasted enough already. Yes, monsieur. Considering how the poor lad must be waiting, suffering, and perhaps even giving way to despair. Villefort shuddered at the idea of the prisoner cursing him in the darkness and silence, but he had gone too far to retreat. Dantes would have to be broken between the cogs of his ambition. I am ready, the shipowner said, sitting in Villefort's chair and taking up a pen. So Villefort dictated a request in which, undoubtedly the best of intentions, he exaggerated Dantes' patriotism and service he had rendered to the Bonapartist cause. In it, Dantes became one of the most significant figures ensuring Napoleon's return. Clearly, when he saw the document, the minister must immediately see that justice was done, if it had not been done already. When they completed the petition, Villefort read it out. That's it, he said. Now count on me. Will the petition be sent out soon, monsieur? This very day. Certified by you? The finest apostille I can put on it is to certify that all you have said in this request is true. Villefort resumed his place and stamped the certification on the corner of the petition. So, what will we have to do now? Asked Morel. Wait, Villefort replied. I shall look after everything. Morel's hopes were raised by his assurance. He left the deputy prosecutor's office, delighted with himself, and went to tell Dantes' father that he would be seeing his son soon before long. As for Villefort, instead of sending the request to Paris, he put it carefully aside for safekeeping, knowing that what might save Dantes in the present would become a disastrously compromising document in the future, in the event which the situation in Europe and the course of affairs already allowed him to predict of a second restoration. So Dantes remained a prisoner. In the depths of the dungeon where he was buried, no sound reached him. of the resounding clash of Louis XVIII's throne, or still the more dreadful collapse of the empire. Villefort, however, had watched this all closely and listened to it attentively. On 2 occasions during the brief appearance of the emperor known as the 100 Days, Monsieur Morel had renewed his efforts, always demanding that Dantes be released, and each time Villefort had reassured him with promises and expectations. Finally, Waterloo. Morel was not again seen at Villefort's. The shipowner had done everything humanly possible for his young friend, and if he were to make any further attempt under the second restoration, he would compromise himself to no useful end. Louis XVIII returned to the throne. For Villefort, Marseille was full of memories that were soured with remorse, so he requested and obtained the vacant post of Crown Prosecutor in Toulouse. A fortnight after moving into his new home, he married Mademoiselle Renée de Saint-Méran, whose father was more in favor at court than ever. So it was that Dantes, during the 100 Days and after Waterloo, remained under lock and key, forgotten, if not by men, at least by God. When Danglars witnessed Napoleon's return to France, he realized the full effect of the blow he had directed against Dantes. His denunciation had been accurate, and, like all men with a certain natural aptitude for crime, and only average understanding of ordinary life, he described this strange coincidence as a decree of Providence. But when Napoleon had returned to Paris, and his voice, imperious and powerful, was heard once more in the land, Danglars knew fear. At every moment he expected Dantes to reappear, a Dantes who knew everything, a Dantes who was strong and who threatened every kind of vengeance. So he gave Monsieur Morel notice of his desire to renounce seafaring, and obtained a reference from him to a Spanish trader, whose service he entered as a count's clerk towards the end of March, and that is to say 10 or 12 days after Napoleon's return to the Tuileries. He left for Madrid, and nothing more was heard of him. As for Fernand, he understood nothing. Dantes had gone away, and that was enough. What happened to him, Fernand did not try to find out. Throughout the reprieve that his absence gave him, he strove partly to mislead Mercedes about the reasons for it, and partly to devise plans for emigration and abduction. From time to time, and these were dark moments in his life, he also sat in the extremity of Cap Ferrot, at the point from which you can see both Marseille and the Catalan village, sad, motionless as a bird of prey, watching in case he might see, returning by one or the other routes, a handsome young man who walked freely with his head held high, and who, for Fernand also, had become the messenger of a cruel revenge. In that event, Fernand was decided. He would break Dantes' skull with his gun, and then, he thought afterwards, kill himself to disguise the murder. But Fernand was mistaken. He would never kill himself, because he lived in hope. While this was happening, among these painful changes, the Empire called for a final muster of soldiers, and every man who was capable of bearing arms marched across the frontier of France in obedience to the Empire's resounding call. Fernand set off with the rest, leaving his hut, leaving Mercedes, devoured by the dark and dreadful thought that when he had gone, his rival might return and marry the woman he loved. If ever Fernand meant to kill himself, he would have done so on leaving Mercedes. His attentions to the young woman, the pity which he appeared to feel for her in her misfortune, and the care he took to anticipate the least of her wishes, had produced the effect that an appearance of devotion inevitably produces on a generous heart. Mercedes had always loved Fernand as a friend, and now her friendship towards him was increased by a new feeling, gratitude. "My brother," she said, fastening on this conscript's bag across the Catalan's shoulders, "my only friend, do not let yourself be killed. Do not leave me alone in this world where I weep and I shall be entirely alone if you leave it." These words, spoken on his departure, gave Fernand new hope. If Dantes did not return, then Mercedes might be his. Mercedes remained alone in that bare landscape, which had never appeared to her more arid, bounded by the vastness of the sea. Bathed in tears, like the madwoman whose painful story we have heard, she could be seen wandering continually around the little Catalan village, now pausing beneath the burning southern sun, standing motionless and silent as a statue, looking towards Marseille, now seated on the shore, listening to the moaning of the sea, as endless as her sorrow, and ceaselessly wondering if it would not be better to lean forward, sink beneath her own weight into the abyss, and let herself be swallowed up, rather than to suffer the cruel uncertainties of hopeless expectation. It was not the fact that Mercedes lacked the courage to take out this intention, but the succor of religion that saved her from suicide. Caderousse was called up as Fernand had been, but, being 8 years older than the Catalan and married, he was not recruited until the third wave of conscription, and was sent to guard the coast. Old Dantes, who had been sustained only by hope, lost hope when the emperor fell. 5 months to the day after being separated from his son, and almost at the very hour when Dantes was arrested, he breathed his last in Mercedes' arms. Monsieur Morel undertook to pay all the expenses of the funeral and settled all the trifling debts the old man had run up during his illness. It took more than benevolence to do this, it took courage. The South was ablaze, and to assist the father of a Bonapartist as dangerous as Dantes, even on his deathbed, was a crime. Chapter 14. The Raving Prisoner and the Mad One. Approximately 1 year after the return of Louis XVIII, the Inspector General of Prisons paid a visit. Dantes heard all the trundling and grinding of preparations from the depths of his cell. There had been a great deal of commotion upstairs, but the noise could have been imperceptible below for any ear other than that of a prisoner who was accustomed to hearing, in the silence of the night, the sound made by a spider spinning its web on or the regular fall of a drop of water which took an hour to gather on the ceiling of his dungeons. He guessed that among the living something exceptional was taking place. He had lived so long in the tomb that he might have justifiably considered himself dead. In the evening, the inspector was visiting the rooms, cells, and dungeons, one after the other. Several prisoners were questioned, those who had earned the goodwill of the governors by their mild manners or sheer stupidity. The inspector asked them how they were fed and any demands that they might have to make. They replied unanimously that the food was execrable, and they demanded their freedom. The inspector then asked if they had anything else to say to him. They shook their heads. What can any prisoner have to ask for apart from his freedom? The inspector turned around with a smile and said to the governor, "I can't think why they oblige us to make these pointless visits. When you've seen one prisoner, you've seen 100, and when you've heard one prisoner, you've heard 1,000. It's always the same old song, badly fed and innocent. Have you any others?" "Well, yes, we have the mad or the dangerous prisoners who we keep in the dungeons." "Very well," the inspector said, with an air of profound weariness. "We have better do the job properly. Let's go to the dungeons." "One moment," said the governor. "We should at least get a couple of men to go with us. Sometimes the prisoners, if only because they are sick of life and wish to be condemned to death, commit vain and desperate acts. You might be a victim of such an attempt." Then take some precautions," said the inspector. They sent 2 soldiers and began going down a flight of stairs that was so foul-smelling, so filthy, and so mildewed that even to pass through the place simultaneously offended one's sight, hampered one's breathing, and assaulted one's nostrils. "Who in hell's name can live here?" the inspector asked, stopping halfway. "Oh, the most dangerous of conspirators, against whom we have been warned as a man capable of anything." "He is alone." "Well, indeed he is. How long has he been here?" "For about a year." "Was he thrown into this dungeon soon as he arrived?" "No, monsieur, only after he had attempted to murder the turnkey who brought him his food." "He tried to kill a turnkey?" "The same one who's holding the lamp. Isn't that so, Antoine?" "He did want to kill me for sure," the turnkey answered. "Well, I never. Is the man mad?" "Worse than that," said the turnkey. "He's a devil." Would you like me to make a complaint about him? The inspector asked the governor. There is no need, monsieur. He's being punished enough as it is. In any case, he is already close to madness, and, judging by what we have observed, in another year he will be quite insane. Well, so much the better for him, said the inspector. When he is altogether mad, he will suffer less. As you can see, this inspector was a man of the utmost humanity, and altogether worthy of the philanthropic office in which he had been entrusted. You are right, monsieur, said the governor. Your remark proves that you have been given the matter a great deal of thought. As it happens, in a dungeon not more than 20 feet away from this one, which is reached by another staircase, we have an old abbé, a former leader of a faction in Italy who had been here since 1811 and who lost his wits about the end of 1813. Since then, he has been physically unrecognizable. He used to weep, and now he laughs. He was growing thin, now he's putting on weight. Would you like to see him instead of this one? His madness is entertaining. It won't depress you. I'll see them both, replied the inspector. We must be conscious about our work. He was carrying out the very first tour of his inspection and wanted to make a good impression on the authorities. Let's go in there first, he added. Certainly, said the governor, indicating to the turnkey that he should open the door. Dantes was crouching in a corner of the dungeon where he had the unspeakable happiness of enjoying the thin ray of daylight that had filtered through the bars of a narrow window. Hearing the grating of the massive locks and the screech of the rusty doorpost turning in its socket, he looked up. At the sight of a stranger, lit by two turnkeys with torches, who was being addressed by the governor, hat in hand, together with two soldiers, Dantes guessed what was going on, and, seeing a last opportunity to petition a higher authority, leapt forward with his hands clasped. The soldiers immediately crossed their bayonets, thinking the prisoner was rushing towards the inspector with some evil intent. The inspector himself took a step backwards. Dantes realized that he had been depicted as someone dangerous, so he summoned up a look that expressed the utmost leniency and humility, and spoke with a kind of pious elegance that astonished everyone in an attempt to touch the heart of his visitor. The inspector listened to what Dantes had to say until he finished. Then, turning to the governor, he whispered, "He has the makings of a religious devotee. Already he is inclined to more benevolent feelings. You see, fear has an effect on him. He recoiled from the bayonets, while a madman recoils at nothing. I have done some interesting research on the subject in Charenton." Then, turning back to the prisoner, he said, "Tell me briefly, what do you want?" "I want to know what crime I have committed. I am asking for the judges to be appointed to my case and for a trial to be held. Finally, I am asking to be shot if I am guilty, but equally to be set free if I am innocent." "Are you well fed?" asked the inspector. "Yes, I think so. I don't know. It's of little importance. What is important, not only for me, a wretched prisoner, but for all of those officials who administer justice and for the king who rules us, is that an innocent man should not be the victim of an infamous denunciation and die behind bars, cursing his tormentors." "You're very submissive today," said the governor. "You were not always like this. You spoke in quite a different manner, my good friend, and the day when you tried to beat the life out of your warder." "That is true, monsieur," Dantes said, "and I humbly ask forgiveness of this man, who has always been kind to me. But what do you expect? I was mad, I was raging." "Not any longer?" "No, monsieur. Captivity has bowed me, broken me, demolished me. I have been here for so long." "So long? When were you arrested?" asked the inspector. "On the 28th of February, 1815, at 2 in the afternoon. The inspector made a calculation. "It is now July 13th, 1816. So what do you mean? You've been a prisoner for only 17 months. "Only 17 months?" Dantes repeated. "Oh, monsieur, you do not know what 17 months are in prison. 17 years, 17 centuries. Above all, for a man like myself, who is on the brink of happiness, for a man like myself who was about to marry a woman whom he loved, for a man who could see an honorable career ahead of him, who was deprived of it all in a moment, who, for the glorious day, was plunged into the deepest night, who saw his career destroyed, who does not know if the woman who loved him does so still, who cannot tell if his old father is dead or alive. 17 months of prison for a man accustomed to the sea air, to a sailor's independence, to space, immensity, infinity. Monsieur, 17 months of prison is more than enough punishment for all of the crimes reviled by the most odious names known to the tongues of men. Have pity on me, monsieur, and beg for me, not indulgence, but firmness, not for a pardon, but a verdict. A judge, monsieur, I ask only for a judge. An accused man cannot be refused a judge. Very well, the inspector said, we shall see. Then, turning to the governor, truly I feel sorry for the poor devil. When we go back upstairs, you must show me his detention order. Certainly, said the governor, but I think that you will find some dreadful charges against him. Monsieur, Dantes continued, I know you cannot yourself make the decision to have me released, but you can pass on my request to the authorities. You can start an inquiry. You can have me brought to judgment. All I ask is to be judged. Let me be told what crime I have committed and what sentence I have been given, because, you understand, uncertainty is the worst of torments. Enlighten me, said the inspector. Monsieur, Dantes exclaimed, I can see from the sound of your voice that you feel for me. Please tell me to hope. That I cannot do, the inspector replied. All I can promise is that I shall examine your dossier. Oh, in that case, monsieur, I am free, I am saved. Who ordered your arrest? The inspector asked. Monsieur de Villefort, Dantes replied. You may see him and consult with him. Monsieur de Villefort has not been in Marseille for the past year, but in Toulouse. That does not surprise me now, Dantes murmured. My sole protector has left. Did Monsieur de Villefort have any reason to hate you? The inspector asked. None at all, monsieur. He was well disposed towards me. So I can rely on any notes he may have left on your case, or which he may give me? Fully. Very well, be patient. Dantes fell to his knees, raising his hands to heaven, and asking God to protect this man who had descended into his prison, like our Savior going down to deliver the damned from hell. The door closed, but the hope that the inspector had brought with him remained locked in Dantes's dungeon. Do you wish to see the committal records straight away? The governor asked, or to go to the abbé's dungeon? Let's have done with the dungeons at once, the inspector replied. If I were to go back into daylight, I might lose the resolve to carry on this dreary task. This prisoner is not like the last one. You'll find his folly makes you less melancholy than the other's reason. What kind of folly is it? A rare one indeed. He believes himself to be the owner of a vast fortune. In the first year of his imprisonment, he made the government an offer of 1,000,000 francs if they would set him free. The second year, it was 2 million. The third, 3, and so on and upwards. He is now in his 5th year of imprisonment, so he will ask to speak to you privately and offer you 5 million. Well, that certainly is curious, said the inspector. What is the name of this millionaire? Abbé Faria. Number 71, said the inspector. This is it. Open up, Antoine. The turnkey obeyed, and the inspector strained to see into the dungeon of the mad abbé, as the prisoner was usually known. A man was lying in the middle of the room, a circle drawn on the ground with a piece of plaster from the wall, almost naked, his clothes having fallen into tatters. He was drawing a very precise geometrical lines in the circle and had appeared absorbed in solving his problem as Archimedes when he was killed by one of Marcellus' soldiers. He did not even look up at the noise made by the opening of his cell door, but only appeared to become aware of something when the beams of the torches cast an unfamiliar light on the damp ground where he was working. Then he turned around and was astonished to see that a group of people had just come into his dungeon. He immediately leapt to his feet, took a blanket from the foot of his miserable bed, and hurriedly wrapped it around him, to appear more decently dressed in front of the strangers. What requests do you have? The inspector asked, not varying in his question. I, monsieur? The abbé said in astonishment. Well, I have no requests. You do not understand, the inspector continued. I am a representative of the government with responsibility for visiting prisons and listening to the prisoners' demand. Ah, in that case it's another matter, the abbé exclaimed, livening up. I hope we shall come to some understanding. You see, the governor whispered, isn't it just as I predicted? Monsieur, the prisoner continued, I am Abbé Faria, born in Rome, 20 years secretary to Cardinal Rospigliosi. I was arrested in early 1811. I am not quite sure why, and since then I have demanded my freedom from the Italian and French authorities. Why from the French authorities? The governor asked. Because I was arrested in Piombino, and I assume that, like Milan and Florence, Piombino is now the capital of some French département. The inspector and the governor looked at one another and laughed. Well, I never, the inspector said. My friend, your news of Italy is rather stale. It dates from the day of my arrest, but since His Majesty the Emperor has created the kingdom of Rome for the son heaven had sent him, I assume that he has pursued his conquests to realize the dream of Machiavelli and Cesare Borgia, united the whole of Italy in one single kingdom. Fortunately, the inspector said, Providence has somewhat modified that ambitious plan, though you appear to me to support it quite enthusiastically. It is the only means by which Italy can become a strong, independent, and prosperous state, the abbé said. Perhaps so, said the inspector, but I have not come to debate ultramontane politics with you. I am here to ask, as I have already done, whether you have any complaints about your food and conditions. The food is like that in all prisons, the abbé answered. In other words, vile. As for my lodging, you can see for yourself, it is damp and unhealthy, but nonetheless quite acceptable for a dungeon. However, all that beside the point, I have something of the greatest significance and the most vital importance to reveal to the government. Here it comes, the governor whispered to the inspector. That is why I am pleased to see you, the abbé went on. Even though you have disturbed me in a most important calculation, which, if it were to succeed, might alter the Newtonian system, could you grant me the favor of a private interview? There, what did I tell you? The governor asked the inspector. You know your man, the latter answered, smiling. Then turning to Faria, he said, Monsieur, what you ask is impossible. Even so, monsieur, the abbé insisted. What if it were a matter of the government gaining a huge sum of money, a sum of 5 million francs, for example? Well, well, the inspector said to the governor, you even guessed the amount. One moment, the abbé went on, seeing the inspector make a move towards the door. It is not necessary for us to be entirely alone. The government could hear what I have to say. My dear friend, the governor said, unfortunately we have already known by heart what you will tell us. You are thinking of your treasure, aren't you? Faria looked at the scornful man with eyes in which any disinterested observer would have surely seen the light of reason and truth. Of course, he said. What else would I talk about if not that? My dear inspector, the governor continued, I can tell you the story as well as the abbé himself, after hearing it over and over during the past 4 or 5 years. That only goes to show, governor, the abbé said, that you are not like those men in the scriptures who have eyes but see not, and who have ears but will not hear. Monsieur, the inspector said, the government is rich and, thank heavens, has no need for your money. Keep it for the day when you are out of prison. The abbé's eyes dilated as he grasped the inspector's hand. But if I don't get out of prison, suppose that, contrary to all the notions of justice, they should keep me in this dungeon and I should die here without bequeathing my secret to anyone, then the treasure will be lost. Isn't it better for the government to profit by it, and for me to do so? I shall go up to 6 million, monsieur. Yes, I would give away 6 million and be satisfied with the remainder if they would set me free. I swear that if one did not know this man was mad, the inspector said under his breath. He speaks with such conviction that you would not believe that you would believe he was telling the truth. I am not mad, monsieur. I am telling the truth, said Faria, having picked up every word that the governor said, with that acuteness of hearing that is peculiar to prisoners. The treasure I mentioned really does exist, and I am ready to sign an agreement with you, under which you will take me to a place that I shall designate, have the earth dug up in our presence, and if I am lying and nothing is found, if I am mad as you say, then you can bring me back to the same dungeon where I shall remain forever and die without asking anything further from you or from anyone else." The governor burst out laughing. "Is it a long way to your treasure?" he asked. "About 100 leagues from here," Faria said. "It's a clever idea," said the governor. "If every prisoner was to take his warders on a wild goose chase for 100 leagues, supposing the warders agreed to it, there's a good chance that prisoner would manage to take us to his heels as soon as he had the opportunity, with which no doubt could occur in the course of such a journey." "It's an old trick," said the inspector, "and this gentleman cannot even claim to have invented it for himself." Then he turned back to the abbé. "I asked you if you were well fed." "Monsieur," Faria replied, "swear to me in Christ's name to set me free if what I have told you is truth, and I shall tell you the place where the treasure is buried." "Are you well fed?" the inspector insisted. "But in this way you take no risk. You can see that it is not in order to contrive some opportunity to escape, since I shall remain in prison while the journey is made." "You haven't replied to my question," the inspector repeated impatiently. "And you haven't replied to my request," cried the abbé. "Then be damned, like the other idiots who refuse to believe me. If you don't want my gold, then I shall keep it. You deny me my freedom, then God will give it to me. Go, I have nothing more to say." Throwing off his blanket, he picked up the scrap of plaster and once more sat down in the middle of his circle, where he went back to his lines and sums. "What is he doing?" the inspector asked at the door. "Counting his treasure," the governor answered. Faria's reply to this sarcastic remark was a look of the most sovereign contempt. They went out, and the jailer locked the door behind them. "Perhaps he did have some treasure after all," the inspector said, on his way up the stairs. "Or dreamed about it," the governor replied, "and woke up the next morning mad." "Of course," the inspector remarked with the naivete of the corrupt, "if he really had been rich, he would not have been in prison." For Abbé Faria, that was the end of the adventure. He remained a prisoner, and following the inspector's visit, his reputation as an entertaining imbecile was greater than ever. Those great treasure hunters, Caligula and Nero, searchers after the unattainable, would have listened to the poor man's words and given him the opportunity that he wanted, the space that he valued so highly, and the freedom for which he was ready to pay so great a price. But kings today, confined within the limits of probability, no longer possess the audacity of willpower. They are afraid of the ears that listen to the orders and the eyes that watch whatever they do. They no longer have any sense of the superiority of their divine being. They are men who wear crowns and nothing more. At one time they would have believed themselves, or at least have claimed to be, the sons of Jupiter, and their manners would somehow have reflected those of their father, the god. What happens beyond the clouds is not so easily controlled, but nowadays kings are well within reach. And as despotic governments have always been loath to exhibit the effects of prison and torture in broad daylight, just as there are few instances of a victim of the Inquisition emerging under broken bones and bleeding wounds, so folly, that ulcer conceived in the mire of dungeons as a result of moral torture, almost always remains carefully hidden in the place of its birth, or else, if it should emerge, does only to be buried once more in some dark hospital whose doctors can recognize neither the man nor his ideas in the shapeless wreck entrusted to them by its tired jailer. Abbé Faria had gone mad in prison and was condemned, by his very madness, to perpetual confinement. As for Dantes, the inspector was as good as his word. On returning to the governor's lodgings, he asked to be shown his committal order. The note on the prisoner was couched in the following terms: Edmond Dantes, fanatical Bonapartist, played an active role when they returned from Elba, to be kept in solitary confinement under the closest supervision. This note was in a different handwriting and the ink from the rest of the order, proving that it had been added after Dantes's imprisonment. The accusation was too precise to allow any latitude for discussion. So above the words, which were bracketed together, the inspector wrote, "No action." The visit had in a sense revived Dantes. Since his arrival in prison, he had forgotten to count the days, but the inspector had given him a new date, which Dantes had not forgotten. Behind him, with a piece of plaster that had fallen from his ceiling, he wrote on the wall, July 30th, 1816. From that time on, he made a mark every day, so that he would no longer lose track of the passage of time. The days went by, then weeks, then months, and Dantes waited. He had begun by setting a limit of a fortnight on his release. If the inspector were to devote half the concern that he appeared to feel pursuing the matter, then a fortnight should be enough. When that time had expired, he had decided that it had been ridiculous of him to think that the inspector would have taken up his case before returning to Paris. Since he could not return to Paris until the end of his tour of his inspection, which might last a month or two, he gave him 3 months instead of a fortnight. When the 3 months had passed, he had found consolation in a different argument, with the result that he allowed 6 months. But when the 6 months were over, adding up all the days, it appeared that he had waited for 10.5 months. Nothing in these 10 months had changed in the conditions of his imprisonment. He had received no encouraging news when he questioned his jailer. The man remained silent as usual. Dantes began to doubt the evidence of his senses, to think that what he had taken for a memory was nothing more than a hallucination, and that the ministering angel who had appeared to him in prison had flown on the wings of a dream. A year later, the governor was transferred. He had been appointed to manage a fort at Ham, and took with him several of his subordinates, including Dantes' jailer. A new governor arrived. It would have taken him too long to learn the names of his prisoners, so he asked only to be told their numbers. There were 50 furnished rooms in this frightful lodging house. The inhabitants were called by the number of that which they occupied, and the unfortunate young man was no longer called by his first name, Edmond, or his family name, Dantes. He became number 34.